The following podcast may include coarse language, graphic content, and politically and/or religiously sensitive material. Those of you who are offended by such content should fuck off. Hey, we're doing something. It's a Daemoneye podcast. Remember that?
No, I don't.
I think we'll do it anyway, though.
Didn't that die off?
Well, yeah, but it's like Cthulhu, Great Cthulhu. That is not dead, which can eternal law, and given strange eons, even geeks may die.
It's the quote is even death may die. I know, I have it opened up right here. I was actually going to use it for my part of the intro.
Oh, but I spoiled it for you. Oh, well.
Asshole.
Oh, well. Okay. Well, welcome to the Daemoneye podcast, the podcast where we discuss tabletop and the electronic gaming, sci-fi fantasy fiction, science, technology, geek culture, and celebrity death matches between celebrity sciences. Next episode will be a grudge match between Neil deGrasse Tyson and James Watson. Place your bets, people.
Watson, all the way.
It's been quite a while since we've done this thing, so instead of asking what you've been up to, we'll just say, what are you doing, or what are you planning these days, Tyler?
Desperately trying to actually finish off Dragonfire.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's a product we've promised to and alluded to for ages, just about as long as the Lycanthrope Club Book 3, which is also in progress, but I think your book's going to beat mine to the press in all likelihood. So,
I hope so.
What time are you thinking? What date?
Well, I'm hoping to finally have primary writing done by sometime around the end of this month.
Around the end of this month? Oof. Beginning of April. Cross your fingers and various other digits. And as for me, well, doing some more writing, trying to get some more stuff going here. As far as prospects go with Daemoneye Publishing, we have Dragonfire coming up very soon. Heavy metal fantasy, gnomes with guns, dwarves with that play metal music which can cause earthquakes. Lots of fun. We have most of the art assembled, and at this point it's just the scut work, getting the index all filed up.
It's not so much just getting the index all filed up. That's actually part of secondary writing. The primary writing that I got to do is I got to finish off a couple of monster entries, and I got to fill out the magic item list with a bunch of stuff that basically nobody's been using because, well, people always seem to go towards the lightning swords and that kind of crap.
And we were going to do a convention for a while here, but the financial winds of chance have kind of postponed that indefinitely. So we were hoping to go to Conquest Sacramento, but again, it just wasn't practical, especially since the book wouldn't be ready by then. So we may attend as just attendees rather than vendors, but other conventions in the future, who knows? We are eyeing, we're Big Bad Con, that's down over in, I think around the San Francisco Bay Area, I believe, or thereabouts. There's also Kubla Con, that's a big one. Maybe not. Again, depends. We'll see what happens. So that's what we have planned on for the future of Daemoneye right now. Anything else, personal or otherwise?
Well, after Dragonfire is done, we're going to be putting Universal Decay on the back burner for a while and focusing on Edition Pi. Planning on producing a visceral horror book for Edition Pi called Heroes of Horror.
We've been playtesting that quite a bit.
Yeah. People really dig the whole playing D&D in a fantasy version of the real world and different time periods thing.
Yeah, there was actually a parallel to that in second ed, the Mask of the Red Death from Ravenloft, I believe.
Yeah, I heard about that. Never got into it, though.
I played it. It wasn't that bad. It's basically used second ed rules, which were only meh, but it did let you play, in the real world with fantasy elements. You could play wizard and blah blah blah. The idea was it's kind of in parallel to Ravenloft. It wasn't that bad. We've played a few games of that, worked pretty well. So I think that's it for the intro stuff. Let's talk about the topic. Fantasy in space. That's 12 A's. I think I got that right. This is also kind of a side or a parallel topic which this kind of touches upon. Why is it that certain settings, certain campaign settings, or even story settings, why are they more popular than others? Like, why is the vaguely Tolkien-esque medieval world, with fantasy elements, far more popular than, say, I don't know, your favorite Dark Sun, which is kind of like a Bronze Age, desperate dark fantasy world? Why do we see more Tolkien-esque crap than the latter?
The depth of the lore. Something like Dark Sun, while it has a lot of lore, it's lore that people have to pick up and run with. It's all fresh. It's all fresh stuff. But if you take something that's pseudo medieval, there's you can not only tap into the lore of whatever campaign world that you're using, but also real world examples of what actually happened back during those times. So that actually allows us to augment the lore of the actual setting with real world parallels.
Well, yeah, we'll be able to explore that more once we kind of get more into the topic. But before, let's kind of make sure we define what fantasy in space is, okay? So this is kind of related to a previous podcast. We discussed, science and technology and magic systems, magic versus technology, etc. But what do we mean when we say a fantasy in space? It's not exactly science fiction. Or even science fantasy, like say Buck Rogers or the pulp stuff. So what is fantasy in space?
It's a mixture of science fiction and fantasy. Stuff like wizards on spaceships powered by nuclear reactors.
Could you call that that's a mixture? But could you also go the other way? We'll get more to this later, but just a pure fantasy in space, where it's. You take the elements of a fantasy world and simply give them access to space.
Oh, yeah. Then you have Starjammer.
Spelljammer, right.
Oh, sorry,
okay,
Spelljammer,
yeah, more on that. Yeah. So most fantasy settings are set on Earth or on Earth-like planets, etc., etc. Maybe there's like a different dimension with weird physics or where reality is a bit screwy, like, say, Ravenloft, Dark Sun to some extent. But it's not a setting where the characters can go from star to star or world to world, where on Earth they go across different culture or some pseudo Asian, some pseudo African culture, but going from star to star or planet to planet, that is a little bit of a different level than that. Okay,
totally.
Again, we can have things like science fantasy where we just have force fields and decombobulators where it at least adapts familiar forms we like a gun is shaped like a gun, and electricity creates some sort of barrier. That's not too unfamiliar, but when we bring together the world of fantasy and space, there really isn't any immediately obvious parallels to that in either past history or in science fiction, right?
Actually, have you ever heard the phrase, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic?
Of course, but the point here is that it's a setting where they don't even try to pretend it's science-like.
Okay. Everybody who's listening to this podcast is probably familiar with the works of Terry Pratchett.
Oh, yeah.
But here's the thing. Terry Pratchett did not start off writing Discworld. One of the first novels that he wrote was called Strata. And what Strata was it was Discworld, but all of the quote-unquote magic was science fiction stuff.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of the magic in Discworld is presented in kind of a scientific milieu. I mispronounced that. Yeah. So why don't we do a compare and contrast to two things? One which I consider pure fantasy in space. The other one maybe more science fantasy, or even just science fiction with magic as an option, or magic given as something else. So Spelljammer, we alluded to that a little while back. Spelljammer was
fantasy.
Yeah, Spelljammer was TSR, the original creator of D&D's attempt to make fantasy, to bring basically fantasy to space. All it was that it introduced this device called a Spelljammer or Spelljammer helm or helmet, etc., when a wizard would put it on, they could basically power or lift things up, usually ships or other things, to leave the planet, and then PCs therefore could leave the planet of like Abertorel or Greyhawk or whatever, and travel to this throughout the solar system of the setting. Okay, there were some additional monsters, space-based monsters introduced there. There were certain spacefaring races, et cetera, but there really wasn't. Across there really wasn't any technology higher than Renaissance tech. I mean, black powder was available. It was called smoke powder there, blah, blah, blah. But that was the limit. There wasn't any attempt to disguise it as some sort of science. It was just still magic. Magic explains everything. You just need a special magical item to make it go into space.
Because magic.
To create this sin, they did draw upon certain existing ideas or concepts when they created the universe. One of which was the idea of a phlogiston.
Yeah, from back in the day when people were trying to figure out why things burned.
Yeah, they also brought the idea of crystal spheres.
Where the stars are just pinpricks in the crystal spheres that lead into, well, in this case, the phlogiston sea.
Exactly. So this is very typical of, or in the few fantasy and space settings I've encountered, this is very typical. They don't even try, or they take huge liberties with how we conceive of space, or how we should say we know space is. They go back and look at, medieval or even earlier concepts of what space is like, what is beyond the planet. In Spelljammer, we have the solar system, it's enclosed in space, etc. But beyond that, there's a gigantic crystal sphere that surrounds the whole thing. And as Tyler said, all the other stars, there are a few planets, maybe a few other suns in some solar systems. Those are actually holes in the giant sphere. Beyond the crystal sphere, you have basically a sea of what's called phlogiston. It's basically this bright stuff that's extremely flammable. And to go from solar system to solar system, you have to navigate through the phlogiston and to get to a new crystal sphere. The phlogiston was an old concept which tended to attribute quality of being flammable to certain objects. Basically, if an object had the quality of being able to be set on fire, it was because it had phlogiston in it. Okay, we now know that's bullshit, but it was an older concept. Crystal spheres goes back even further. I think it might even be a philosophical or even like a mythological thing, right?
Oh, it's mythological. Crystal spheres goes all the way back to Mesopotamian times.
Yeah. So instead of there being billions of actual other suns, most of those things they see are just pinpricks in the hole. And that's what kind of, I think, distinguishes, in some regards, or can or should, fantasy and space from other things. It's just they don't even try. They create a whole new universal mechanism, a whole new concept of what space is, and you can draw upon older ideas from mythology or from older concepts in science. Another example of this, which veers more into the science fantasy than actual fantasy and space, but it's worth mentioning because it's a good example of that. Space 1889. Have you heard of that one, Tyler?
Oh, yeah, that's the one that used Jules Verne-style technology with liftium or something like that to be able to allow people to defy gravity in ships and sail from one world to another. Almost literally sailing from one world to another.
Yep. That one is really more science fantasy because there's not really any magic in there. However, they do draw upon an older concept called the aether or luminous aether. The idea being that they were trying to explain why light has wave-like properties, not realizing it's both a wave and a particle. So they describe light as traveling through this stuff called ether, spelled in A-E-T-H-E-R. There was an experiment a while back that disproved that, but the approach that Space 1889 takes is that aether is real and that Thomas Edison, or more likely in reality one of his assistants, developed some technology to propel ships through the aether, allowing them to sail from planet to planet, and eventually discovered this unobtainium called liftwood, which allowed things to break through the gravitational plane. So again, not really science fantasy, because beyond those, it's really more science fiction, but it's an example of how when you're creating a space world that you want to run on different rules, you can look at mythology or old antiquated science ideas. Because why would you want to do that? Well, it's original, it's new. I think if you want to create a new original setting, there's a lot of interesting stuff. I mean, scientific quackery and disproved theories are, they're kind of forgotten, and they should really rich material for building a new world or a new universe in fantasy.
Yeah, one idea that I had a while back that I was messing around with was the idea of spell warping. The idea would be to have an augmentation system on your ship, for lack of a better word, that would enhance the effects of a spell, such as, say, Expeditious Retreat from D&D, which functions by making it so that every one step that you actually move counts as, or gives you 2 steps of distance, essentially compressing space for you, and making it so that effect applies to the whole ship, and then enhancing it. Then your ship, then your ship moves 10 feet, but as far as the rest of the universe is concerned, it just moved 10 miles.
Kind of a parallel with the Dead Stars method of FTL travel.
No, it isn't so much. It isn't really teleportation. It's more like a slingshot-portation.
Well, yeah, but the idea is that you have a character has a personal effect on the ship and has a device which lets it affect the entire ship.
Yeah. Similar to that.
So basically, you could have things like, I don't know, like a magic-powered spaceship, or, I love this idea, unicorn-powered spaceship, or if you have a unicorn plugged in there, you use its teleportation to teleport the stars. Unicorn-powered spaceship.
Yeah.
Unicorn inside. Technology. Oh, God, that actually would be an idea for, if you did a world like that, you could have some sort of adventure where the characters investigate and they find these poor innocent unicorns being forced to be living star engines. There's an adventure seed idea for you right there. Yeah. Okay, I brought fantasy and space up. The whole reason I did this for the podcast because it's kind of an underappreciated genre, and there aren't many examples of it. Or if they do, it falls under the, we have, it's in space, but we have magic in there just for the hell of it, kind of like Outlaw Star. They have magic in there for some reason, but it's mostly sci-fi. But I wanted to, explore different avenues, different ideas, and getting on the topic I mentioned beforehand, the secondary one, why are certain settings more popular than others, even though they're more creative and they have a deeper lore base? Or, why don't people get sick of the same thing over and over again? And you kind of touched upon that when I responded.
Yeah, it's like I mentioned, I think a lot of it has to do with the depth and the realism that can go into these worlds. For instance, take a look at your stereotypical medieval fantasy world. We can draw on what happened to cause things like the War of the Roses, and use those as plot mechanisms in order to generate a conflict, or in order to generate an adventure, or even an entire campaign in something like the Forgotten Realms. Same causes, similar personalities, but now in addition to having knights and horses, you have dragons and wizards. And yes, I did just flip those around, so it intimated that dragons were riding wizards.
Basically. You have parallels for it in the real world, and you have parallels for Tolkien-esque fantasy, because again, it's just Middle Ages with fantastical races, some from legends, some of mythology, some invented stuff like sort of like halflings. Then you have in science fiction, we can hypothesize what technologies may be available to us based off, projection. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, well, more like 40, 30 years ago, cell phones, that's what science fiction essentially, but it was kind of inspired by Star Trek, because we could project and we could see it might be one day possible to make circuitry small enough and to develop sophisticated enough communication systems that could make essentially communicators possible. And here they are today. But then you mix the two and you get into something there really isn't any obvious parallel to in history or in science. And I think that's where the kind of the popularity thing goes into, because this goes in fiction as well. People emphasize with stories more when they can see themselves in it. It's easier, it's easier to read about some schlub, working a dead end job if it's an enthralling tale than it is some schlub in a fantasy world trying to rescue the princess. There's the escapism element. That's why it's attractive, but on a deeper level, people emphasize more with things that are familiar to them, and that's why Tolkien-esque fantasy, I think, and sci-fi is more popular because you know about the history. This actually happened in the real world. When we start to create these new things, these new systems, new settings that don't have any obvious parallel in the real world, or it's more of a stretch, it's harder for people to get into it, I think.
I agree. But that's not the topic of today's conversation, I thought.
Well, that's just kind of parallel to, again, we have fantasy in space. It's an interesting concept, has a lot of ideas, but why isn't it, and more things like it, popular?
Yeah, that actually is kind of odd. I've noticed that a lot of there actually are popular fantasy and space intellectual properties, we'll say. I can think of one right off the top of my head. Even has space wizards.
Which one is that?
Star Wars.
Oh, there we go. I would still call it more of a sci-fi with magic elements, kind of like Outlaw Star, but that's a good example. It's still not pure. It's not pure fantasy in space, but it's closer. Yeah, I can understand. It's a good example.
And then there's also Dune.
Dune, that's a good one. It's very popular. Yeah, another example of that. But again, it's science fiction with some fantasy elements thrown in there.
Well, yeah, but Dune even uses its fantasy elements for its method of space travel.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yep. So maybe not as unpopular as I thought, but it's still not quite as, I'm just saying that it's not as popular as some other stuff, I'd say, except Star Wars. But again, I would argue falls in the category of sci-fi, or people look at it that way, even if it really isn't like that.
I agree.
Yeah. The popularity of Star Wars, again, we're talking about the original Star Wars. I mean, I think that's because it was also just a really damn good story. And if you have a really good story, really good characters, you have a lot more flexibility, a lot more room to work with the setting, even if it's not that familiar. The fact that they introduced such a universe where they refer to things in the movie that they didn't immediately explain, but the audience still followed along, that was just more strength of the storytelling and the writing, I think, on their parts. Oh,
totally.
Yeah. That being said, all other things being equal, I think there's not as much popularity because of the aforementioned reasons. It's not a familiar setting. It takes more work for you to learn the lore, to get what the setting is about. And if it's not as familiar, seems like it takes more work. But I'd say that's what makes it more rewarding to play in it.
Well, there are popular science fiction fantasy settings. So, admittedly, most of them aren't space-style settings. Like, for instance, Shadowrun isn't a space-style setting, but it is literally science fiction with fantasy shoved into it. So it doesn't get much more mixed, in a blender than Shadowrun.
Yeah, but again, the reason why I find just fantasy space interesting is because I mentioned that there really aren't a lot of parallels or ideas in, say, history, but if you look into mythology and to old ideas put forth by philosophers and natural philosophers in the 15th, 16th centuries or further back, they did have some pretty extensive theories on how space might work. I mean, we mentioned the Phlogiston and, of course, crystal spheres and aether, but I mean, if you do a little research, you find all these interesting ideas pertaining to how space might work, what the world might be like beyond Earth. And I think there is that just a rich, untapped source of ideas.
Actually, trying to prepare for today's topic, I was trying to find my copy of a book, but I can't find it. And I think I might have loaned it out and never gotten it back.
I hate when that happens.
I can't locate it online. I can't remember the author. Hell, I can't even remember the name of the book, but it was something simple like Towers or something like that. Mm-hmm. Anyways, the idea of the book is mankind has developed our science to the point where we can actually go out into the universe. And what we find as we're going out into the universe is that we've already been there. We come across an Earth-like world, and we find that there's already a human society there. And it turns out the reason for that is because all of the modern day stuff that we have with like alien abductions and all, or scenarios and all that, that's actually been happening. They call them the gardeners, and what they've been doing is throughout human history, they've been like monitoring and sampling human societies, and whenever there's a population that looks like it's on the brink of extinction for one reason or another, they take them and they transpose them and deposit them on another world that's very similar to Earth, to maintain diversity and all that, spread the garden, hence the gardeners. Well, one of the populations that they put down on a recently rediscovered world is the population that was getting executed in Europe during the Middle Ages, burned at the stake and all of that. Not just people who are accused of being witches, but people who actually could do magic. So you have this one world that by the time we get there, for thousands of years, has been developing with magic use as just like a common fact of life. Practically, or it's like you flip a coin and you come across somebody who can do a minor spell, like they can do stuff like make wood break along a seam, or cause flowers to bloom. And then it goes on even in further that you get into actual wizards who are capable of learning spells from other people and recording and researching and developing those spells. And these wizards aren't the industrial magnates of the planet. There's no Ford Motor Company. There's the Ford automatic carriage company that enchants carriages to be able to go from point A to point B via magic.
Let me guess, they start developing a space program with wizards.
No, because it turns out magic is a phenomenon that requires the electromagnetic field envelope of a planet to be able to function. Basically, the electromagnetic fields of a planet that protects it from solar radiation has the flip side of like gathering ambient magic that exists in space and condensing it. So magic is actually available in space, but you would have to put in the amount of effort necessary to create a fireball capable of blowing up a building in order to light a cigarette. So it's just completely not worth it. And I wish I could freaking find that book, because it was a very interesting take on the idea of magic in space.
And I want to give an example here, one which actually helped inspire this topic, and that would be Fail Better Games, Fallen London / Sunless Skies universe. Are you familiar with that system / setting game?
Isn't that or isn't that like a computer game style thing?
It is a computer game, yes.
And all that?
Yeah, but
I've heard about it, and I've heard people talking about it. I've seen a couple of videos on it, but I never got into it.
Well, let's start with where it began. Fallen London. It was a browser-based game, and actually won an award from the most rich and detailed storytelling one. And it was a little bit of play to win to it, but I've seen the system. I don't play it myself. It's actually not that unreasonable. Later on, Fail Better Games made an actual computer game, not a browser game, for Steam called Sunless Sea. And then later that spawned the sequel, which I've been playing a lot, called Sunless Stars. Put it out here. I'm a big fan of Fail Better Games system because they have created one of the most original and then one of the most creative and good universes I've ever come across. And what's interesting about the way they do it is that they don't maintain like an official wiki or a lore on the website. They kind of make it so if you want to learn about their games, the system, you have to actually play them. And they kind of even discourage players from posting that stuff. They still do, of course, because it's the internet, but the community kind of encourages people to explore it themselves. So there's still a few things that are mysterious, or used to be mysterious when it started. What makes it so interesting is the universe in which it takes place. So, huge spoiler alerts if you're interested in learning this yourself. But the idea in Sunless Skies / Sunless Sea / Fallen London is that all the stars in the universe are not actual just balls of flaming gas. They are actually living creatures called judgments. And all the physical laws in the universe, such as gravity makes things go down, or fire burns, or a person must die after when it gets old, they only exist because the judgments say so. Starlight is literally all the judgments in space saying these things have to work this way. If all light were taken away and there was just darkness, anything would go. And in this system, in Sunless Skies, when I'm playing most recently, the idea is that you go into like around the early 1900s, just around the time when Queen Victoria was supposed to die. The idea is that you take all this Victorian, attitudes of we can do anything, we can conquer the world, and then you give them access to spaceships. The idea is that London escaped, they literally transported London brick by brick over a space of 30 years, or at least most of it, to the heavens, and now the Queen Victoria, who lives immortal on the throne of hours, because apparently you can mine time here and preserves your life indefinitely. They have now literally a heaven-spanning empire, having killed off the local judgments. I mean, that's just the start of all these beautiful concepts, and they draw heavily from these various pieces of mythology and from various things in the 1800s, 1700s. There's like an area in the game called Piranesi, based off the drawings of an artist called Piranesi, who drew all these really weird prison-like sketches. It's a prison without walls that basically traps a person there until they can change themselves. Again, I mentioned this before, time is literally an object that can be mined, and it can be used to preserve life, or it can be used to, say, speed up time relative to other places. So imagine you take a Victorian workhouse, where you have all these orphans working like 12, 14-hour day works, shifts, toiling in a factory. Now throw in time manipulation. Basically, so you basically send in an orphan in a day. The next day he comes out, he's like a teenager, or maybe he's an old man because he's been working for like 30 years, where outside of him only a single day has passed. You get a lot of, that's how they were able to build London so quickly. They only had 30 years, but they can compress time and they can speed things up. Of course, people die earlier, but hey, they should be lucky. They were fed the entire time. And of course, to actually travel to the stars, you have to basically have spaceships. They're called locomotives. They're basically locomotives which don't have any wheels, and they're powered by the correspondence, the star speech that changes physical laws. So basically, people have learned how to basically write some of the simpler letters of the correspondence. They can use it to basically propel ships through space, through literally space-based technology. And again, the idea here is that it's kind of like science, but it's really more verges on magic, because remember, all physical laws in this universe are arbitrary, subject to the whims of the judgments. If we can play with them, anything is possible. And of course, it's called Sunless Skies because the stars are dying out. It's creating more space for the lesser creatures. Now we're seeing what's out there.
Well, something I've been thinking of concerning that setting that I was talking about with the spellapults. The reason I called it spell catapulting for space travel is the engine makes it so that every X feet of movement is X times whatever feet of movement and relative to the rest of the universe. This Earth spins at several thousand feet per second. So what happens if those thousands of feet become thousands of miles? You're not going to be, or the pull of gravity is not going to keep your freaking ship on the surface of the planet. So the way the whole spellapult thing works is you wait until nightfall. You aim your spellapult at a star. While you're on a vessel, you move around until you're sailing in the general direction of that star, and you turn on the spellapult, and you're ejected from the planet, just instantly through the planet, through the atmosphere towards that star at several multiples of the speed of light. Eventually, as you get closer to that star, you look for another stellar object using magic, and then as you pass that stellar object, you activate the spellapult again, this time aimed at that stellar object to basically break.
It's like pinball in space, basically, almost.
Yeah, and then then you can do a survey of the area, find out if there's anything there that you could actually inhabit, and if not, you've just reverse process and teleport yourself back to the planet, or back to Earth, or even back to another star if you have a good enough navigator, until eventually you find a place to settle down, and in that way, kingdom or nations would. Or what I was going to do is I was going to set it back in Arthurian times.
Ooh.
And I was going to call it the Merlin Drive.
Ooh, that's nice. And see, that's kind of what I'm getting at here. In some fantasy worlds, we have floating cities. You have magicians who can like cause entire continents to rupture, or it's is why wouldn't it make sense for even earlier in there for some wizards to think, well, I can travel the dimensions. Is there a way to get off the planet? Maybe there's some cool stuff up there, Ninth level. Why can't there be a ninth level spell which can do that? And if that's even accessible to some wizards, wouldn't soon kings become interested in that? So it honestly kind of makes a lot of sense once you get to a certain level of magical advancement to start looking at space exploration. And that's, again, an interesting way to take an original way to take a campaign setting. And there's a lot of opportunities for that.
Well, another thing that I was going to do was I was going to make it so that the heliosphere, or so that the rules for magic change depending upon what heliosphere you're in. There will be a base rule for for how magic functions when you're between heliospheres. But once you leave, once you enter a new heliosphere, like let's say, healing magic just plain doesn't flat out freaking work between heliospheres. But healing magic works perfectly fine in Earth's heliosphere, but you go to another heliosphere, and now healing magic causes curses that turn people into undead.
Ooh. So you have basically the area in space you are can affect that. So navigation charts suddenly become very important in such a setting where, like, this area of space, don't do this, or else you'll turn into skeletons. Area of space here, don't cast any fire spells. Your entire spaceship will go up in flames.
Or even worse, entering a heliosphere where the magic that the Merlin Drive is based on just plain stops working.
Dead zones, basically. So you have to just get out and paddle or something.
Yeah, something like that. The horrible thing about it is you would only know that rule exists after the first ship, or after the ship gets there and doesn't break and never returns or reports back. Or maybe maybe divination and communication magic still works, so they report back, we got no breaks and we're about to plummet into the local star. I would recommend not sending another ship.
And here's another thing you can do in space settings in fantasy. You can create new sky beasts, new monsters in space. I mean, look at the idea of the constellations. Maybe some of those creatures are actually out there.
What I was going to do is I was going to have solar flares be world-eating, or be like world-eating serpents.
Yeah, you can use like old explanations for like supernovas, or I think there's some books like from medieval times or even earlier or more recent, which kind of propose all these hypothetical legendary creatures that could live out in space. I mean, take a little bit of research to find them, but that's there. Honestly,
as interesting an idea as this, or as the Merlin Drive setting is, I think that while it would be an interesting game, it would make a better either novel series or a computer game series.
Oh yeah, I mean, we're not restricting ourselves simply to role playing games, but also PC games or novels. Absolutely, I'm saying this in general, gaming in general.
Oh, I was just bringing that up for people who are going like, "Ooh, I wonder if they're going to make a game like that." The answer is probably not in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, we need actual programmers and people to start buying our shit in droves. And of course, fantasy and space also gets into certain Lovecraftian themes too. I mean, because again, the idea in Lovecraft, one of the core concepts, along with cosmic nihilism, is the idea that the physical laws we know of are localized and not important, and magic is the true physics of the world. So basically, that explains why magic overrules that, or certain concepts.
The law of action and reaction only exists because of powerful magical spell makes it so.
Yeah, maybe that law of association does always apply, just that it's so weak in, say, maybe the planetary atmosphere that doesn't always apply. Then local weird by the universe standards laws, like, I don't know, physics and law of gravity overrules it. But most of the rest of the universe, magic is king.
That brings up something. There's a novel series called the Night Lord series.
That sounds rings a bell, yeah.
Yeah, first off, I highly recommend it. The books are long. I mean, like hundreds of pages, like massive tomes, but you don't notice. It just keeps there. It just pulls you in. The main character of the series is a engineering professor. Let's say he hooks up with the wrong girl at a bar, discovers that not only vampires are real, but so's magic. And he approaches magic with an engineer's mindset. He figures out like the rules on how it functions, or how to alter runic languages to get different effects, and he comes up with some, using very simple magical concepts. He comes up with some insanely good physical concepts, like for instance, the rule of contamination, where if you have like something something that's good for you, and it comes into contact with a physical object, like let's say a sword. Now walking around with that sword can improve your health. Well, what he does is he figures out that that same system can be used to actually make it so that physical materials can be transferred via the law of contagion, and he may call it the armor generator. So it's basically this table. You lay down on it, somebody lights a fire at the other end of the table, and as the fire produces smoke, the smoke gets layered on top of whoever's on the table and forms a segmented suit of carbon fiber armor. Just pure carbon fiber. Like basically you're walking around wearing black diamond armor.
That's much more flexible than diamond.
Exactly, and insanely more durable because, well, there's no flaws in it. After all, why would he make a spell that makes flawed armor?
Quantum.
But my idea is in a space magic setting, you could actually use magic to make engineering workarounds. For instance, energy, the ability to carry energy on a spacecraft is always a big hang-up for writers, whether you're writing a game or whether you're writing a novel or anything. You have to have enough energy on your ship to do everything the ship needs to do. But if you say you use the law of symmetry, basically two identical objects or two similar objects, one can be used to affect the other. The same thing that some voodoo dolls are supposed to work on. You can use that law to plug the quote-unquote voodoo doll of your ship's engine into your generator back on your home planet, and now your ship doesn't have to have a generator the size of a city block on board, because it's getting all of that power through the voodoo doll on the ship.
And there's another idea for a setting. We get into space because all the hidden wizards and goblins we have a broken masquerade, they get revealed. The scientists say, well, hey, show us how this shit works. And suddenly we can develop a fast and light drive with their magic. Why don't you guys come out sooner? This is awesome.
Yeah, or like that Mirror Rorem setting that we were using for one of the Dragonfire playtests.
Mm-hmm.
Where there's a fantasy world and our modern world basically end up getting bonded together by a permanent gate between them. So we end up with a world where that uses magic for its technology, and now we have like an embassy city there. Very what was it? What was the name of that anime? Gate, and thus the JSDF fought there.
Yep, there's also Outbreak Company, although that's not quite as interesting, I'd say. But funny.
Yeah, Outbreak Company is more like, good for a laugh and a chuckle, but I wouldn't say that Outbreak Company has any rewatch value.
True, true, true. Another idea for saying, of course, this is not really fantasy in space or space fantasy, that aliens invade and they were only able to fend them off because all the fantasy folk come out of the closet to help us beat them back. Another idea for setting right there.
Or all of our legends of dwarves and elves and magic and all of that are true because they're all aliens and that used to have like a colony world here, and for one reason or another that colony world died off, and now the alien ships that are all powered by magic because that's their idea of technology are come back to get revenge, and that's how we discover them, or the basic laws of magic is fighting a resistance against them.
Oh yeah, I think there's a novel sort of like that where it's not magic, but it's in a world where anti-gravity is actually ridiculously easy, and it's only by cosmic fluke humanity didn't discover it earlier. So we have all these aliens come invade the planet, but they're doing so in like the 1950s, 60s, and they're attacking us with basically with muzzle loaders and cannons on wooden ships, which happen to be able to float. I forget what I can't remember for the love of me what that saying is called, but it's an interesting one. So but all this is kind of our point. Bring space with fantasy and vice versa. I mean, again, as we went into, it's not as popular, for reasons we went over before, but if we just stick to the same thing over and over again, there's no growth, no creativity, no new ideas get explored, and I think there's a lot of room for growth in space with fantasy. There's a lot of room.
We have been wanting to expand the Daemoneye family. Shall we see if anybody has enough experience and talent to maybe work on something like this for us?
Well, we're always accepting submissions, so if you have anything, send it in.
Admittedly, we're kind of like on the dink side rather than the huge side.
We've published though, and very few. And you're surprised how people who actually try to do this don't do that.
Yeah,
we are on Amazon.
At least we know the ins and outs of how to get it done. And the more people under one umbrella, the more everybody under that umbrella benefits.
Yeah, we're on Lulu, but we don't publish like Velociraptor porn. We actually have our own ISBNs. Yeah, because it's so easy to get a book on Amazon, but we actually could get it in bookstores now. Okay, enough self-aggrandizing. Okay. Anything else you want to add?
Velociraptor. Instead of publishing Velociraptor porn, we publish circuit board porn. And yes, that was a joke.
Yes, I'm glad it was. Anyway, so anything else you want to add or end this on?
Want to kill all humans?
Well, that's kind of standard. It's like I'm breathing, Tyler. What else?
We could sit here and go for hours, if not days, and just reciting and reminiscing over all of the different science fiction and fantasy games, properties, videos, whatever that come together. But one that we should have touched on, however we didn't, is the movie The Fifth Element.
Oh, again, I would categorize that as science fiction, mostly with some fantasy elements, but it's definitely worth mentioning. Yeah.
Yeah. I figured it would be a travesty if we didn't acknowledge that, yes, we know it exists, and it is awesome, and one of the true horrors of our time is that there was never a sequel.
Oh, there's one other one we should mention, though. I mean, it's really only two movies that are worth mentioning, but we should.
Yes.
The first one is really pure, I would say pure hard sci-fi, but I'll mention anywhere. Pitch Black and Chronicles of Riddick. The remake, not the original.
What do you mean the remake?
Well, remember the original one in the movies, The Chronicles of Riddick? That was kind of shitty. The director's cut, though, was good.
Oh, yes. The director's cut for Chronicles of Riddick was actually pretty awesome. Yeah, Pitch Black was just... there's a reason Vin Diesel is a star.
Yes. Yeah, that was just pure sci-fi. Well, not hard sci-fi, but pretty sci-fi. The second one, definitely science fiction with fantasy elements. I mean, there were freaking souls in it and the undead.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. So, but again, notice how those two things still aren't quite fantasy and space. They're rarer than you think, honestly. And I think it's a genre worth exploring. Yeah.
Since we're in the epilogue period, we should discuss what we're going to be doing for the podcast going forward. Well,
we're going to try to do more of these on a more regular basis. It might get a little. We probably won't be able to do it every month, but we'll keep trying to get going. Anything else you wanted to add to that?
The audio from the recorded game sessions.
Oh, I forgot. Yes, we have some recorded games. That our playtesting / group played. So if you want to hear an entire role-playing game session from our group, that has been kind of edited, so it doesn't have a lot of ums, ahs, long breaks. So it's actually you can listen to it. So we'll be hopefully uploading that sometime in the near future.
Yes, because what we were thinking about doing is consider this as like we want people's input on whether or not to do this, but we were thinking about making it so the podcast was like a once a month thing, and where it's just Tristan and I sitting together, and the remainder of them would be segments from the playtesting sessions. Like we would have like the first half of one playtesting session that would go for like an hour and a half or so of podcasting. The second half of the second half of that same session for an hour and a half, and that way you could continuously follow the story of the campaign from beginning to end, as well as getting these breaks for Tristan and I to come in and talk about what we're doing.
Yep. And we're not doing the Dark Germany game though, Tyler.
No, all recordings of that game have been burned, and the earth in which the fires were set has been salted. And
consider who it is that is saying that.
That game got dark fast.
Yeah, and I'm glad you have at least some moral fiber to sense that.
What kind of fiber? And what?
Don't kill everybody, because then there's no one to get you stuff.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Okay. All right, and that's probably as best a note as we can stop here. This has been the Daemoneye Publishing Podcast episode, whatever. I'm Tristan Eifler.
I'm the reason your mother cries at night.
And we'll see you sometime on a distant star, a distant planet.
Ooh.